Over the last 64 years, the Harley-Davidson Sportster has become one of the most globally recognized V-twin cruisers in history. In 1957, when the first Sportsters rolled off the assembly line, the Harley-Davidson engineers had a goal to make a lighter, more nimble, and overall faster motorcycle. On the Sportster would be the first time that Harley-Davidson engineers incorporated the overhead valve system in their V-twin motors. Between new technology like this and a lighter, more advanced chassis, the Harley-Davidson Sportster blew away the competition at the time and was considered to be one of the most versatile and competitive platforms on two wheels. Whether it be on-road cruising, off-road scrambling, or flat-track sliding, the Sportster engine could do it all. The number of applications and the types of bikes that it could be in were limitless. Time went on and the Sportster continued to remain one of the main staples in the Harley-Davidson lineup. But along the way, did Harley-Davidson somehow lose sight of their originally intended purpose of the Sportster? At what point was the sport in Sportster lost? Was it due to a lack of innovation and progression within the model lineup? Or did the Sportster motorcycle fall into a category of bikes that it was never originally intended to fall into? I would argue that it evolved to fit a different niche within the riding community. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. The current generation of riders never knew the Sportster as the speed-dominant machine that it once was. Nowadays, the Evolution Sportster has fallen somewhere between the classification of a beginner's bike, a budget-friendly bike, or a modded-out bobber DIYer-friendly bike. But times are now changing. The Evolution engine is now replaced with the Revolution Max engine, a platform that once again puts the sport back in the Sportster. With the modular design of the Revolution Max platform, it also puts the versatility back in the Sportster platform as well, and allows the HD engineers more latitude to create truly uniquely new motorcycles. Did Harley-Davidson design a bike that's worthy of the word sport being painted on the side of its gas tanks? Will the old school traditional Harley-Davidson enthusiasts accept this new technology of the Revolution Max, or will it be shunned by some and accepted by others? This is my one day, one tank of gas, first ride and impressions on the Harley-Davidson Sportster S. I was fortunate enough to ride the Sportster S in the two environments that I personally feel like are the best suited for this bike. So I think I'm going to start off with some of what would normally be the concluding points on a review, and that is ultimately some of the best ways and places to ride a motorcycle like this. So the first place we started off in was downtown LA. So the Sportster S is going to be a bike that really excels in urban environments, places where you're stopping and going a lot, heavy traffic, a lot of stoplights, places where the low-end torque and power up to mid-range are real favorable on the motorcycle, which the Sportster S definitely has. And the second place we were going to head to is Angeles Crest, which is just north of downtown LA. Angeles Crest is one of the most popular canyon riding roads in Southern California. For a couple reasons: you have long stretches of windy canyon roads, nice scenic vistas of downtown LA, and a rad community of other motorsports enthusiasts. So between densely populated urban areas and canyon carving roads, these are the two riding environments that I think are best suited for the Sportster S. Can the Sportster S do the long straight highway riding or the two-lane remote country roads? Yeah, absolutely, but that's not where the Sportster S really flexes its prowess. Alright guys, so let's talk first about the engine and chassis on the new Sportster S. So the Sportster S has basically ditched the air-cooled Evolution engine that has been running since the 80s on the Sportsters and replaced it with the Rev Max, or the Revolution Max engine. The Revolution Max engine is the platform that the Pan America was built on. For those of you who are familiar with the Pan America, the new adventure touring motorcycle that Harley-Davidson just launched this year as well. The Rev Max represents a huge technology step for Harley-Davidson's in general, control. So let's dive into this new motor. I'll give you guys some of the details and specs on this bad boy. So the Revolution Max is a 60-degree V-twin liquid cooled engine. It's got a dual overhead camshaft design, and it's quite a bit different than Harley-Davidson's traditional big twins that you see like on the Milwaukee 8, which is a pushrod system. What the overhead cam design does is it reduces the valve train inertia, and it allows the bike to produce higher peak horsepower. The dual overhead cam design also allows for the variable valve timing to be integrated into this engine as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with variable valve timing, what that allows the computer to do is advance or retard the timing on both the intake and the exhaust valves. So depending on where the engine speed's at, it will allow the brain of the motor to increase or decrease the amount of overlap in the intake and exhaust valves. The variable valve timing allows for the computer to advance or retard the exhaust and intake camshaft timing independently of one another through a potential range of 40 degrees of camshaft rotation. This is accomplished through a timing phaser that's located between the cam drive sprocket and the camshaft. It uses a solenoid plunger to control ported hydraulics that change the cam timing. Most overhead cam engines require a valve adjustment every like 10,000 miles or so. One of the awesome things about the Rev Max is it does not require any valve adjustments due to the hydraulic lash adjusters that are found inside the valve train. So the Rev Max uses a roller finger valve actuation with a hydraulic lash adjuster, which saves a lot of time and money and services, and it also reduces some of that valve train chatter that's present, especially on cold starts. The Rev Max also features a dual spark plug technology, which is more important because you do have a over square engine design on this, meaning that the bore is bigger than the stroke, which is very common in higher revving water-cooled engines. Speaking of revs, this bike redlines at 9,500 RPM, which is significantly more when you compare it to the air-cooled V-twins like the Twin Cam and the Milwaukee 8 and Harley-Davidson's typical Harley lineup, which is another reason why this engine produces considerably higher horsepower numbers. So on the Sportster S, you have what's called the Revolution Max 1250T, the T standing for torque. On the Pan America, you had the Rev Max 1250, which put out 150 horsepower and 94 foot-pounds of torque. The Sportster S has been retuned, and this is a big misconception that I've already seen a lot of people talking about on the internet. A lot of people have the misconception that the Sportster S is somehow detuned. The Sportster S engine, the 1250T, puts out 120 horsepower as opposed to the 150 that the Pan America puts out. And so let me jump into some of the key differences between the Rev Max that's in the Pan America and the Rev Max 1250T that's in the Sportster S. So the Sportster S has been retuned, not detuned, and what it's tuned to do is perform better in low to mid-range RPM. After riding both of these bikes, especially the Pan America, I own a Pan America, I've ridden it a lot. The Rev Max, first of all, let's just get this out of the way. The Rev Max is the real deal. It is a legit badass engine. This engine never ceases to surprise me every time I get on it. But the reasons why the Sportster S Rev Max produces less power is a few things. First off, and the main one, is the fact that the cylinder heads have smaller valve and port dimensions and have a different combustion chamber shape. The main objective, like I mentioned already, was to build this engine with torque in mind. And that's something I definitely felt on the Sportster S. In most riding conditions, for most people, they would actually say that the Sportster S was a faster bike than the Pan America. Again, depending on what type of riding you're going to be doing. If you're doing a lot of city street riding and canyon riding, the 1250T is going to be a better suited engine, and you're going to have more access to the power at the RPM that you're in most often. Now, if you jump on the freeway and you start hitting the top end and you really start getting to those higher RPMs, then the Pan America is going to start to shine. It's going to start to pull away from the Sportster S. What a smaller valve and port dimension design does, it allows for that combustion chamber to suck in more fuel and air faster at low RPM. With the larger ports and valves on the Pan America, this doesn't do as well, especially from that 3,000 to about 5,000 RPM range. So on the Sportster S, you've got about 10% more torque from 3,000 to 6,000 RPM when compared to the Pan America. The other thing, the compression ratio on the Sportster S engine is 12:1. On the Pan America Rev Max, it's 13:1. And then you've also got a different camshaft profile on the Sportster S as well. Again, tuning it to that low end torque and favoring that out of the hole power. And in addition to the different camshaft profile, you've also got a different tuning for the variable valve timing as well. So this is one of many reasons, guys, why I'm going to tell you why the Sportster S is not a bike that is a good long haul touring bike. You probably would have guessed that already. Does it have the capabilities of hauling ass on the freeway still? Absolutely. This thing will still smoke any bike with the Milwaukee 8 in it. And let me just get something out of the way as well, guys. When we talk about a new generation of Sportsters and the next step above the air-cooled Evolution, no. This is about 10 steps above the air-cooled Evolution engine as far as technology, speed, and every measurable metric of performance you can think of. Harley-Davidson basically rode the air-cooled Evolution Sportster train for a really long time. And it's funny because to this day, the Sportsters sell really, really well. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I feel like it just became this nostalgia masterpiece that had so many benefits to it, like the price, the amount of custom parts that were built for it, the look, the feel, the style, everything that people would expect from a Harley-Davidson. And so no one was really begging for this bike to be changed. There were a lot of naysayers that said Harley-Davidson needs to increase its power. But most everybody that owned the Sportster felt like it had adequate power for what it was and what they expected. And there were other driving catalysts that were forcing change, like emissions, especially in Europe with its stricter and stricter emissions regulations. So the Sportster S really just represents something completely new, something that is now up to speed and up to snuff on every technology piece, from your suspension to your engine to your lighting to your braking. Everything has been taken to the max on this when compared to other bikes within this class. Miles on the Sportster S, and my initial reaction is the bike's an absolute bullet. I mean, the power to weight ratio is awesome. The suspension, if I could say one negative thing, the suspension in the rear is definitely limited. You know, and I hate comparing this bike to the Pan America because they're both on the same RevMax platform, but really they're totally different bikes, and so you can't really compare the two. But you do have less travel in the rear suspension, so going down the freeway at highway speeds, you know, you definitely felt that more. I got the preload dialed in now, and so we'll see if that helps a little bit. It's not bad, it's just not, you know, just coming off the Pan America a few days ago, it's definitely different. You hit that torque curve, you hit right in the sweet spot around like 6,000 RPM, and the torque of this bike is awesome. You feel like you have a lot more of that torque and pull right out of the hole, so taking off from a stop, you feel like you can take off a lot quicker than the Pan America. So I feel like a lot of people felt like this engine, because it did 121 horsepower as compared to the 150 horsepower of the Pan America, that it was a detuned RevMax, and that couldn't be further from the truth. It's just tuned differently. The cam profile, the heads are different. It's more tuned for a torque delivery, power delivery, which I feel like suits this bike really well because, again, it's for canyon carving, urban areas, immediately getting in and out of traffic, that stoplight to stoplight, stop and go power. Like, so, you know, a bike that you're stopping and going a lot, you want the power where you use it the most, right? Whereas on the Pan America, out on the highway, doing like those long touring things, you want the power and more on the top end because that bike's going to be, it's made to be moving down the road for a longer duration. So I feel like they tuned the RevMax engines appropriately for this bike and for the Pan America. But yeah, Harley definitely put the sport back into the Sportster, that's for sure. So we're headed up Angeles Crest now, and so I get a little bit more feel for the bike, try a little bit of the different modes. I've been in road mode right now, and I felt like road mode was right on the money. The engine braking going in and out of the turns and the curves was spot on. Power delivery, the throttle response was awesome. You know, mostly in, you know, second, sometimes third gear on this road. Yeah, you want to obviously keep this bike at a higher RPM. It is a, you know, liquid cooled bike that revs up to 9,500 RPM, so it is designed to rev up faster than your traditional Evolution air-cooled motor. There was a rock slide, by the way. We saw a car going down the road, and just this big pile of rocks just crumbled down the mountain and like covered the entire surface of the road with a bunch of rubble. And so now we're trying to warn people of the rock slide that just occurred. But yeah, it's pretty crazy. It's the thing, one of the dangers of riding on canyon roads is you never know when you're gonna have like a huge rock slide. So let's talk a little bit about the chassis of this motorcycle. Like I mentioned before, the Revolution Max engine and platform has a lot of very modular properties about it. Not only does the Rev Max provide the powertrain, but it also acts as the main structural component for the motorcycle chassis as well. So unlike most all the other Harley-Davidson motorcycles that have come before this, the Sportster S does not have a traditional steel tubular frame to it. You basically have three frame elements that bolt directly onto the engine. So by making the powertrain a stressed member, or the central structural component of the motorcycle chassis, you're accomplishing a couple things. You're reducing the potential weight by a large margin, and you're also increasing the rigidity of the chassis in a major way. You're getting a lighter handling bike, better power to weight ratio, and a tighter, better handling motorcycle as well. Because the powertrain is a stressed member of the chassis, a lot has been done to the engine to fortify it and strengthen it to stand up to the external forces that the subframes put on it. The swing arm on this bike is a welded tubular steel trellis style that has a braced design and a stamped X member to increase the stiffness of the chassis. This is a little bit different than the Pan America. The Pan America has a cast aluminum swing arm on it that looks a little bit more of a traditional style. You do have really high-end suspension on this bike. You've got fully adjustable premium front and rear Showa suspension on the Sportster S. In the front, you've got a Showa 43mm inverted cartridge style forks, and in the rear, you've got Showa's piggyback reservoir shock. The suspension obviously is quite a bit different than the Pan America, and I apologize if you guys get sick of me comparing this to the Pan America, but these bikes are the two first bikes built on the Rev Max platform, so I think it's informative to let you guys know the differences between these two, which may also constitute some of the price differences as well on the two motorcycles. This bike, by the way, comes in at just under $15,000. The Pan America is about $20,000. The Pan America, $5,000 more. When I say $20,000, that's the Pan America's Special, which represents the bulk of the Pan Americas that have been sold thus far. Pan America Special has fully electronically semi-active suspension on it, which basically means it will actively electronically change in the moment in the situation based on your riding cadence, the terrain, the weight you have on the bike, and things like that. The Sportster S does not have that electronic suspension. You do have the ability to adjust compression and rebound damping, as well as the preload in the front and the rear. In the rear suspension, you've got a hydraulic preload adjustment that you can adjust on the fly with an external knob. The other settings I mentioned, like on the front forks and the rebound and compression damping in the rear, will all have to be adjusted with the screwdriver. The suspension does really well for this bike and the intended riding application, meaning it does really well for the sportiness and the handling and everything this bike goes for. Like I mentioned in my in-the-moment reaction, this suspension can get rough on the freeway. If you're doing high speeds, you start hitting the bumps and whatnot, this bike will beat you up a little bit. That being said, it's still a lot better than the Evo Sportsters. You do feel a heck of a lot more planted on this bike as well, despite the fact that this bike weighs a lot less than the Evo Sportster. This bike comes in at 502 pounds wet. The old Evo Sportsters came in at about 564 pounds wet. Fuel capacity on the Sportster S is 3.1 gallons, which is one more thing that would really dissuade someone from taking a long road trip on this thing. The style of the fuel tank is awesome. It definitely has some of the lines that are reminiscent of the old flat track racer, the XR750. I'll get a little bit more into the style in a minute, but of the three remaining Evo Sportsters right now, that's really not that much less than the two irons. The Iron 883 and the 1200 both have a 3.3 gallon, and the 48 right now has a 2.1 gallon. So the Sportster S has a 49 mile per gallon rated fuel economy. I think in reality, when you're really getting on it and riding it like a normal person that wants to go fast and use the bike for what it's intended for, you're probably going to get closer to about 40 to 45 miles per gallon. So you can expect to get about 120 miles per tank on this thing. On my test ride this day, we went through a little bit more than one tank of gas. The Revolution Max is a unitized powertrain, meaning that the engine and the transmission are both housed in one common case, which is pretty typical in the motorcycle world, but it's pretty atypical in the Harley-Davidson world. All the big twins historically and to present day have had a separate engine case and transmission case that bolted directly up to one another. The transmission is a 6-speed that uses a mechanical or cable clutch. The transmission, after riding it on the Pan America and then the Sportster S, I gotta say it's smooth as butter. The clutch pull effort is very minimal. I'd say it's a lot easier to pull than even the hydraulic clutch on my Milwaukee 8. So I really don't miss having a hydraulic clutch on the Rev Max. The transmission shifts really smoothly. You don't have that distinct mechanical clunk that you typically have in like the Milwaukee 8s. And you've got a lot of features built in the clutch as well, like the slipper clutch and the clutch assist that reduces the clutch pull effort as well. So So I think when the bike was first announced and the pictures and the videos started rolling out, there were a lot of skeptics about the wheel and tire size. The bike was postured as a really high performance motorcycle, and yet you've got these really big fat tires on here. Is Harley-Davidson pulling another FXDR stunt? What's going on here? And I had a lot of the same questions in my mind as well. It's like, wow, how are those wheels and tires going to handle on this bike that's supposed to be a performance driven motorcycle? So let's talk about the wheel dimensions for a second. So you've got a 17-inch wheel in the front, a 16-inch in the rear. In the front is a 160 millimeter width, and in the rear it's a 180. So on paper, I think a lot of people would be like, wow, that's really going to be a sluggish wheel in and out of the turns and transitioning from one lean angle to the next. And I have to say, I was very pleasantly surprised at how well this bike handled. It really is a strong handling bike, and I'm not just saying this. Those of you who've seen my Fat Boy and like breakout reviews, I'm pretty transparent about the way that bikes handle. The FXDR as well did a lot better than it looked. I was actually pretty surprised by that bike, but in no way does that bike even get close to the handling capabilities of the Sportster S. And as I looked at it a little bit closer, I think probably the tire profile and the shape of the tires has a lot to do with how well this bike handles. You've got a little bit more of a peaky tire shape to it, especially in the front, and you can notice it. I never felt like it was sluggish going in and out of turns or initiating turns. Usually with really fat tires, you gotta slow down to even initiate a turn because it really wants to stand up straight. I never felt that way on the Sportster S. I'll get into the style of the bike as a whole in a minute, but while we're talking about wheels, I thought I would mention that the wheel style and the finishes on the wheels are not my favorite. That's kind of just a personal taste thing, but the spoke design and like that dull flat black that has a little bit of a texture on the wheel, personally I don't like it. If it were up to me, I'd have a little bit different spoke design on the wheel, and I'd also have a nice shiny gloss finish on the wheels. I just feel like it's a little bit more of a premium look, and this being the best of the best, the most premium Sportster in their lineup supposedly, I just feel like those small little changes would go a long way. That being said, I love the meatiness and the muscular look that these fat tires give the bike. You definitely have like this wide stance bulldog look to the motorcycle, which is a huge contributor to the overall look of the bike. Again, I'll get into a little bit more on style in a minute. Aside from the tire size on here, I think the other real radical feature visually on this bike is the exhaust system. You've got a high mount exhaust system that goes straight back. The inspiration and the look and the design on this exhaust system definitely can trace its roots back to the early flat tracker days. One more feature that looks like the XR750 of old. One of the major concerns that I've noticed a lot of people talking about on this bike is the fact that the exhaust system is so close to the right inner leg of the rider. So I decided to really make a note of this when I was riding the bike and test it out to see exactly how hot it got. So I know one of the biggest concerns about this bike is that upswept exhaust and the heat and coming on your leg and everything. We just got off the bikes and I can put my entire hand on this exhaust. It's definitely warm, but it's not burning me. Now this part, the muffler portion of the exhaust, that's definitely really hot. But your leg comes down off of the shield and rests right here. So if you have the jeans on or pants, there's no way that's going to burn you. So the key here is you've got a multi-layered insulation, including glass-filled nylon, and you combine that with the outer shielding, and this thing really mitigates the heat in a big way. And like I showed you there, you can literally put your bare skin on the pipe when it's at full operating temperature, and it will not burn you. And the plus side is you've got this really cool radical exhaust straight from the factory that looks nothing like most any other production motorcycle out there. For the lighting on this bike, you've got LEDs all the way around. You've got bullet turn signals LED in the front and in the rear. You've also got a bar style brake light in the rear. You've got this appendage arm that comes off of the swing arm that houses your license plate holder and your 3 tail lights back there. Not the most attractive thing in the world, but it's got to hang behind the rear wheel, I'm sure for legality purposes. I'm sure right now the aftermarket companies are working on some type of a tail kit that will mount those lights off of the rear fender. I really like the pill-shaped headlamp design on the front. It's a unique look that really distinguishes this bike as the Sportster S. There aren't any other Harleys in the lineup that use this style of light. It does resemble the headlamp of the Fat Bob a little bit, kind of that rectangular shape to it, but the headlamp style definitely goes with the theme of this bike, which is a modern version of a collection of old classic styling elements. So we took a pit stop here. We're halfway up Angeles Crest Highway. We're almost to Newcomb's Ranch, I think. And so on this leg of the road, I did sport mode 100% of the time. The biggest thing I noticed about sport mode is you just have access to more power earlier on in the RPM range. So on the road mode, I felt like you really didn't feel like that kick of torque came in until about 6,000 RPM. You had plenty of power down low, but just like that really like where you feel like, okay, this is the full extent of the power. That didn't kick in until about 6,000 RPM where you really feel like that burst of power. In sport mode, it's almost like you have access to that power a lot sooner in the RPM range. I feel like you have way more torque, even as low as 3,000 RPM. And I feel like the cruising speed, engine speed on this bike is around 5,000 RPM. 5,000 RPM is kind of right there in the middle, where any lower than that, you're probably going to want to downshift if you really want to grab a lot of throttle. Sport mode, the throttle is a lot more twitchy. I feel like you have a lot more of the power at a lower RPM in sport mode. The engine braking is a lot more aggressive too. So if you're going fast into the turn, slowing down, then accelerating out of the turn, sport mode's great because you have a lot of engine braking. You don't have to use a lot of the brakes. We're just talking about the brakes. I really made it a point to really get a good feel for the brakes as well. The brake lever effort, or the lack thereof, I should say, is probably the best I've felt on a Harley-Davidson. The brakes are phenomenal, and I know a lot of people's perception was that the brakes weren't going to be adequate because they weren't dual disc brakes. A lot of people said, wow, you're going to put that much power on a bike and not do the dual disc brakes. So you've got radial mount monoblock, 4-piston calipers, Brembo brakes. So the braking, especially with the weight of the bike, you're at 500 pounds for the weight of the bike. This bike, it requires very little lever effort to stop this thing. I'd say even more than the Pan America. I personally like a really sensitive brake. I like to just one finger the brakes and have all the power right there. But I feel like the brakes were extremely good. You're not gonna miss not having a dual disc brakes. In fact, I'd probably say the braking and the engine are probably the two best. If I had to say the bike had, one weakness, I'd probably say the comfort in the suspension. It's a stiff ride. You don't have a whole lot of suspension in the rear and the tail end. And you feel very planted on the road. It's a very sporty suspension feel for sure. Hitting the twisties and going through the twisties, I feel like it's set up and suited well for that. I did make a adjustment to the preload, which was very easy to do on the side of the road. There's a knob on the left-hand side of the bike near the tail end of the bike. And I did dial in the preload exactly as Harley-Davidson specifications are. About 210 pounds, 11 clicks is what they called for. And that did help out a bit. One more reason why this really isn't like a big freeway touring bike. A little bit buzzier too than the Pan America, and that's me being like overly sensitive about everything because I don't feel like it is buzzy, but I just feel like it sustained highway speeds. The engine doesn't like it as much as the Pan America. Coming out of a stop and stopping, this bike I'd say is better than the Pan America. Accelerating out of a turn or coming out of a stoplight or stop sign, this bike just is a lot more fun and playful to ride, which it makes sense because that's the type of buyer that I see buying this bike. Someone that wants to ride aggressively in the corners, a guy that wants to rip through the urban environment. This bike definitely accelerates harder out of a stop than the Pan America. The power on the Sportster S is just more in line with where the meat of the power is on your traditional big twin V-twin motors that Harley-Davidson's made for years. Of course, this is completely different, but what I'm saying is the power is more in line. That low RPM torque is the feeling that you get from the Sportster S.
So let's take a close look at the seat here. So we'll talk about the good stuff first. So the seat definitely delivers a very cool modern spin on a classic flat tracker style. Once again, really emulates the lines and the profile of the XR 750 flat tracker. It really meshes and integrates well with the tail end of the bike, if you want to call it a fender back there, and then that body shroud that begins to wrap around the top of the exhaust system. This in combination with the tank just really gives you like that flat tracker feel, which has that blast from the past race inspiration behind it. Now for the negative, this is not what I would describe as a comfortable seat. The seat is not really built for comfort. I can definitely see how this would favor someone if they're shifting their weight and they're really getting aggressive on the twisties and they want to shift their weight left to right. Also, as I was going down the freeway, there really is not a whole lot of cupping or support to this seat either. So if you jump on it real hard, you're not going to flap the back of the bike, but I mean, there's just really no lower lumbar support on this bike at all. So just one more thing to add to the box of reasons why this is not a long distance motorcycle, but more a motorcycle that delivers a really rad style that has performance and style as the very first two priorities, which is exactly the way that it should be on this bike.
Sportster S is completely packed with a suite of electronic goodies on here. A heck of a lot more electronics than any other Sportster in the past, by far. So you do have electronic cruise control on here, which to my knowledge is the first time cruise control has ever been offered on a Sportster before. You have a circular 4-inch TFT display, which is a really cool styling point in and of itself. You have a circular screen as opposed to trying to put a rectangle in a circle. Harley went to the extra effort to put in that detail and do it the right way that a lot of people will never notice, but little details like that go a long way with me. Within the 4-inch display, that's going to control a lot of different things. You've got your ride modes. You've got 2 custom ride modes that you can customize, things like the throttle progressivity, the engine braking, the traction control intervention, things like that. The software and navigation is very similar to the Pan America if you're used to that. The Sportster S does have all the features that come on the RDRS, the Reflex Defensive Rider System. So it does have the 6-axis IMU sensor, the inertia measurement unit, which among other things measure the lean angle and whether or not you're in a turn, and then based on that data and feedback, it tailors your traction control and your ABS and your torque drag slip control features. Basically everything that's designed to not make your wheels skid or break traction. If you have a headset on your helmet, you can link that up, then you can listen to music through your headset, have navigation instructions through your headset. You do have to use your cell phone with the Harley-Davidson app to use the navigation. Me personally, I haven't had very good luck with the navigation yet. It does take some getting used to, and it does rely heavily upon cellular connectivity to get the navigation. But now let's finish up with styling. So Harley has said that they wanted the Sportster S to be their halo bike, which in vehicle manufacturer terms, it's the vehicle that basically showcases the platform where they throw everything at it, and it's supposed to be the most impactful and really showcase everything there is about that family of car or motorcycle or whatever it may be. So when styling this bike, Harley-Davidson really went in with all these really cool radical design elements. Things I've already mentioned, like the fat tires, the high mount exhaust, elements like the flat tracker style with the seat and the tank, pill-shaped headlamp. You've got these really cool chocolate satin finishes on the rocker box covers and on the derby covers, which tie in nicely with some of the graphics on the tank. So this is just a very visually stimulating bike. There's a lot going on here, a lot that many people probably overlook. All in all, I think the designers and style team at Harley-Davidson had a huge project on their hands when they got tasked with the job to redesign one of the most iconic families of motorcycles that the world's ever seen. How do you reinvent the Sportster in a way that is pleasing to everybody? I think the styling elements are awesome. Like I mentioned before, the one thing I would change is just the wheel design, but I do love how they went out of the box and took some risks on some of the design elements on this thing. This bike just looks really, really tough and definitely makes a statement for the first Sportster on the Revolution Max platform. There's really no doubt that Harley-Davidson put the sport back in the Sportster as well. This is easily one of the fastest bikes that Harley-Davidson has ever made, and it's light years faster than the old Sportster setup. And as Harley's already said, this is just the first of many more Sportsters to come. Personally, I can't wait to see what they do next. Let me know what you guys think. What do you think of the new Sportster? Are you going to miss the air-cooled Evo Sportsters, or are you happy to see them go? Are you happy about the future of Harley-Davidson that's hitting us straight in the face right now? Or are you a little bit more hesitant about what's to come with the Revolution Max engine in it? Thanks a lot for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving me a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. If you're looking for a Harley-Davidson in Southern California, hit us up here at Laidlaw's Harley-Davidson, where we have absolutely no added dealer markup or dealer fees. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. I'm Matt Laidlaw. Later.